So our paper is titled Real Democracy Now. There is an actual paper, I'm pleased to announce. Kind of a draft form, but it does exist. And it's about democratic responses and pressures for political economic change. What we're talking about is a little bit about the context, as we've been talking about the whole day, is a context of global economic crisis that has had several implications in different areas. Some of them we've considered here throughout the day: welfare, work, finance. But what we're interested in is looking at how this crisis has amplified what we consider is a mismatch between democratic institutions and citizens, or how democratic institutions are or are not responding to citizens' demands and needs. And perhaps we are witnessing also a political or democratic crisis. We think that there is a tension developing where crisis management is placing increasingly constraints on policy making. I think that's not new. In fact, most of the presentations we've seen today have focused on that, whether it's in relation to welfare state developments, whether it's in relation of work and employment protection legislation, or whether it's in relation of finance and public financial institutions seem to be able to do pretty much what they want to do. So, whilst this is happening, and we acknowledge that that is certainly the case, we think that this is only half of the story, or one side of the story. But we need to go into the other side of the story, and the other side of the story, we think, is that citizens are increasingly innovating the repertoires of political participation, and are finding different ways of kind of engaging at different levels with the polity in this sense. And we've picked two case studies in order to kind of make our argument. And we've picked two case studies and to the same year in order to kind of start our argument. The first one is Spain. Here's a picture of the Plaza Catalunya in Barcelona, one of the main squares in Barcelona, which, as you probably know, was occupied on the 15th of May 2011, together with many other squares in many other cities of Spain. And it was the response to a very deep economic, financial, and political crisis that the country was suffering then. It was just a few days before municipal elections at the time, where people just thought that the management of the crisis was being carried out for specific interests and not for the common good, however we may define that. And the cry at the time was that of real democracy now. So there was an element, a very clear cry for that. This was, we argue, a new kind of cycle of struggle, or the start of a new cycle of struggle, a new cycle of protest, where, in Spain at least, appeared large coalitions of challenging actors that were facing, increasingly, and still are facing, a stronger authoritarian state. In fact, a few days ago, the Spanish state approved a citizen security legislation which forbids most types of protest and quite a lot of other things. The second case study is Britain. These pictures are of the occupied campsite that was set up outside St. Paul's Cathedral on the same year, a few months later. The pictures are from November 2011. And actually we can see, in terms of this British cycle of struggle, again, the banner over there saying real democracy now. So the same outcry was also happening here. And well, quite a lot, that one, in fact, those masks used by Anonymous and the League for Independent, the Guy Fawkes masks, were also very much used in the 15M movement in Spain. So we see that quite a lot of those more identity type of things were happening on both places, even though they were quite far enough. Now I'll pass over to you.
Okay, so I suppose one of the kind of premises to the paper is that we may well be able to sit in seminars and decide that welfare policies, too austere labour market policies are too focused on liberalisation and flexibilisation, and that economic management should be counter-cyclical rather than pro-cyclical, but obviously us thinking that doesn't bring it into effect. So I guess the question obviously is who and how would actually make the type of policy changes that we're interested in also happen. So in order to try to address that type of question, we basically look into the literature and try and find, or argue that there are, roughly speaking, three models of how democratic processes impact upon the contemporary political economy. So we call them the liberal progress model, the social mobilisation model, and the overflowing and excess model of democracy. So I'll just sit like this so I can see them as well. So if I go through in turn, so liberal, social mobilisation, and overflowing and excess. So in terms of the liberal model, we look at people like Russell Dalton especially, who talks about how a lot of the challenges that democracy is currently seeing in terms of declining party membership, declining voter turnout, declining trust amongst the populace with the political elite, and increased de-alignment, so that people no longer feel kind of a sense of social a sense of kind of obligation and connection to a particular political party. That all of that is happening, but that's not a reflection of a malaise within democracy, but rather that is an increasing level of sophistication of democracy. That people are increasingly able to engage with the polity, and that the polity itself is able to adapt to those changes in the way that the electorate view the polity. Okay, so how does that then translate into to sort of political economy change? We look at people like Przeworski, who talks about policy tinkering as a response by policymakers to new demands. And we look at people like Huber and Stevens, who you might perhaps expect to normally be in the next group, but they're arguing in their most recent piece in Socio-Economic Review that basically political economy policy outcomes, for example, welfare generosity, are largely a response to voter preferences and unemployment. So there's also a degree to which policy change responds to need. So if you have higher unemployment, then you get increased welfare generosity, for example. Okay, so that's the first model. Included in those kind of predictions are that they would expect some kind of anti-incumbency bias, so whichever party oversaw the build-up of the crisis would do badly after the crisis, and also kind of focus on things like electoral systems. So in those countries where there's a proportional representation, you would expect a more inclusive, social democratic type policy response. Okay, so the second model is what we call the social mobilisation model, is basically talking about democracy as a configuration or an outcome produced by different levels of mobilisation and demobilisation by different social groups. So I guess most obviously that would be things like regulation theory, and we talk about Boyer, who talks about how we can view the shift from the kind of Fordist model to the post-Fordist model in terms of, in the first instance, the mobilisation of organised labour, and in the second, in the movement to the post-Fordist model, the demobilisation of labour, but the mobilisation and the mobilisation of the financial industry, so that those different levels of mobilisation of different groups produce different outcomes. We might also add into there the kind of varieties of capitalism literature. He talks as well not just about how social groups are mobilised, but also how those forms of mobilisation are also institutionalised and integrated within the state normally. So, for example, Bob Hankey's doing work at the moment talking about the way in which trade unions can be represented, organised labour is represented within institutions of coordinated wage bargaining, and how that will produce more moderate wage claims and therefore be a means by which, for example, bubbles can be avoided and responses to tendencies for economic imbalances in terms of trade can be avoided. Similarly, in terms of impact upon the labour market, other authors are talking about how what was termed internal adaptation would be more likely to be seen within countries where labour is organised and institutionalised, whereas we're more likely to see unemployment and the pushing down of wages as the means by which adaptation within the labour market will occur in those contexts where labour isn't organised. So you can see clearly the link between the way in which democracy is considered and conceptualised, and then the types of sort of political economy outcomes to be expected. And then a third model, we argue, is one that considers democracy as a process, or as a process of overflowing and excess, which is perhaps captured by the title of Azzolini and Citrin's book, which is titled "They Can't Represent Us." And we talk largely around about the way in which there's a kind of growing divergence between an increasingly engaged and politicised populace and an increasingly unresponsive and repression rather than concession-oriented political elite. So we talk about there's kind of two processes going on at the same time. The first is that for a number of reasons, which include reduced opportunities for concessions because of the context of the current nature of global capitalism, changing patterns of production, distribution and consumption, and especially a kind of much greater focus on individualization, individual methods of production, the disintegration of vertical supply chains and so on, as we talked about in previous sessions, the increase in, and then on the participation side, we see things like the increase in information technology, enabling democratic citizens to operate and coordinate outside of formal institutions of political authority. A general historical and cultural learning process that's seen large-scale institutions typically come to be considered to be associated with bureaucracy and the inhibiting of individual creativity and freedom. So that we see basically a kind of an increasing divergence between political institutions and the public or the populace. So as Christina Fleischer-Fomenea puts it, the rise of autonomous movements from the 1960s to the present also reflect this spirit of freedom and the opposition of autonomous social movements to more institutionalized forms of political organizations, which continues to represent a central cleavage in the global social movement landscape. So we're seeing basically on the one hand, because political institutions are unable to respond, a much stronger focus on repression, and also a much stronger focus on commodification as a means of social control. So we talk a bit about Lazzarato and talking about the construction of capitalist subjectivity as a contemporary mechanism of control. And then within those newly innovative new forms of political participation, as Pollyanna talks about in her book out this year, that those forms of participation and protest also have a much stronger emphasis upon internal forms of democracy, largely as a result of the experience of not getting democracy through the formal institutions of political authority. Okay, so so we talk a little bit perhaps about how those three models help us to understand political economy outcomes in the two cases.
Okay. So in the case of Spain, what we find is, in terms of the liberal model of democracy, we have, well, the insights are a little bit contradictory in a sense, because electoral preferences are not actually related to what is happening in the street. So when I put you the picture of those people in the middle of the square at 15M, the elections that were to happen a few days later happened, and the right-wing party won by an overall majority, so it won majority of the council. So what was happening in the street and in the squares was not being channeled through the electoral preferences that people were showing. And in terms of other types of preferences or worries or difficulties that people are facing, we see that in the majority of the opinion barometers that the Spanish Sociological Institute carries out they do it every month, but they publish them every 3 months. For the last 3 years, what we've been seeing is that unemployment is clearly the single largest issue of worry. That's not surprising. Unemployment is currently standing at 24% for the overall population, over 55% for young people, so that's not really a huge surprise that it's the largest fixed problem as perceived by people. But actually austerity is only mentioned by less than 1% of the people asked as a particular worry. So austerity, even though hundreds of thousands of people are taking to the streets to protest against things to do with austerity, turns out that when asked is not their largest worry, or not just the largest worry. It actually comes up on the list in position 20-something, and it has moved between position 21 and position 30. It is pretty much quite at the bottom of the list. There is also, in terms of what we would expect to have, is that there is a very clear consensus, even though sometimes there is disagreement, a very clear consensus between the main left and the main right-wing party. So what would be the equivalent of the Labour Party and the Tory Party in Britain, which would be the Socialist Party and the Popular Party in Spain, have had quite a consensual agreement over how policy should change. For example, the constitutional change introducing a deficit cap at 3% was done with the consensus of the two main parties, including only one governing at the time. And it was actually the Socialist Party who was governing when that was approved. And the only level of disagreement tends to be over social policy protection, but not over things like, for example, labour market regulation. So they're both very much in favor of full flexibilization, etc., etc. What happens then with the social mobilization model? Well, in Spain, the historical situation is that since the transition to democracy, there was a very high level of institutionalization of the two main trade union confederations. That meant that the two main trade union confederations were crucial in ensuring the stability of the transition. And actually, the stability of the democratic transition was seen to be paramount and more important than anything else. So even in the early 80s, they agreed to kind of wage moderation. They tried a lot of different paths. They were in agreement with the majority of the changes to introduce further temporalization and flexibilization of the labor market. In general, they've been part of a tripartite kind of corporativist structure that has ruled Spanish labor relations for the last 35 years. And what we see is that basically during the crisis, what we witnessed pretty much has been a continuation of labor and social policy changes. So there has been moves towards a further kind of liberalization of the labor market, maintaining a level of protection for certain groups of workers, which I think you've mentioned in your paper very clear. So the rigidity of the Spanish labor market, actually it's a rigidity that only affects a percentage of the workers. There is a temporary contracts in Spain since the 1990s have been affecting over 35% of the workers, which would not be that good. And if we go to the excess and overflowing model, or kind of more autonomous, then what we're witnessing is a heightened state repression, and basically there's a parallel trend. So as kind of autonomous movements are becoming more and more organized, state repression also gets to the next level, and then movements seem to find the next level to kind of overcome that state repression. So it's basically a chase as to who is going to be more oppressive and who is going to manage to get away from that repression. And 2011, probably in terms of a small periodization, as you can see there, 2011 probably initiates a new cycle of struggle with 15M and the occupation of public squares. From 2011 to 2014, there is an increased number of protests, but more disaggregated protests, and particularly they've been going on around austerity and housing evictions. They have been two main issues. So a lot of protests in relation to health healthcare services and the cutting of those services, education, as well as the housing issues that I've mentioned before. And 2014 is probably the year where there has been a strategic turn in that cycle of struggle. And that's something that I'm not sure we'll have much time, but if not, we'll perhaps have the questions. But there has been a lot of these autonomous movements are getting organized in an effort to take over the institutions. The first exemplification of that, which probably you're all aware, is the political party called Podemos, which in the European elections, it was created in February, it stood for the European elections in May, and it obtained 5 MEPs. It was a huge surprise, nobody expected it to do so well. Now, since, well, even before that, in cities like Barcelona, Madrid, Seville, a lot of other cities, but particularly the example of Barcelona, where a group of social movements have developed an electoral candidature for the next municipal elections in May that has a lot of chances of possibly even winning the council. And that is coming from a kind of very autonomous, self-organized manner. What's interesting about this is that it's not seeing democracy in the way that the liberal model sees it or the social mobilization model, but rather they're seeing it as an extension of struggle. So there isn't a belief that if they win, wherever it is that they may win, whether it's the general government or the city council, that they would be better channelers of citizens' demands, as it would be for the liberal model. There isn't a belief that if they win, they will be able to give concessions to the social groups they represent, which would be the second model. And actually, there is a belief that if they win, what they will do is they'll be able to transcend the institution itself. So they will just be able to transcend and create something new, not from the institution itself, but outside the institution.
Okay, so if we look at what's happened in the British case, we do the same kind of way of looking at it. So insights from the liberal model, from the social mobilisation model, and then from the excess and overflowing model. So from the liberal model, basically what we say is, well, public opinion would seem to say that that take welfare especially, that welfare spending cuts are necessary, but that they need to be done in a less severe way, which is, I guess, roughly speaking, what the Labour Party say as well. So we should, if that's the case, see a shifting of support away from the Conservative coalition towards the Labour Party, which we argue has largely not occurred, and in fact the Labour Party still tends to be, in terms of opinion polls, held responsible for the scale of the necessity of cuts in the first place. So we argue that the kind of liberal model doesn't really allow us to understand why public spending cuts are being implemented in the way that they are. The social mobilisation model fares a bit better in that it would roughly speaking say, okay, union density isn't too bad in the UK comparatively speaking, but the ability of trade unions to effectively challenge the government or to effectively challenge the employers is significantly hampered by the anti-trade union legislation which was put in place in the 1980s, and by the low levels of strike incidences, the low levels of militancy that has historically existed for at least the last 25 years. And so that level of weak trade union militancy would likely feed into an inability to steer public policy responses to the crisis away from a kind of austerity, labour market flexibility, and pro-cyclical policy responses, which is essentially what we've seen. So we've seen some forms of official trade union opposition to some of the more austere forms of crisis. For example, the British Airways cabin crew dispute, the 11-week strike action by the Leeds refuse collectors, and then a series of short but normally one-day public sector strikes around pay and pensions. But most of those have been largely ineffective in terms of ability to really steer things in an opposite direction. And likewise in terms of so labour market regulation, for example, we've seen, despite arguably, we can explain perhaps the ability of the government to do things like increase the threshold for claiming unfair dismissal, or for increasing the fees that you now have to pay to take a case to an employment tribunal, again in terms of that sort of structural weakness of organised labour. So the social mobilisation model fares a bit better. And then in terms of the excess and overflowing model of how we view democracy, we say that, so I think first of all we say, well, the tendencies that we're seeing in the Spanish case are much less pronounced in the British case, arguably because the crisis, or the impact of the crisis, has been much less evident. But nevertheless, we see similar trends at perhaps much more of a nascent level. So we've seen, for example, the Lindsey oil refinery dispute, which went on for much of the first half of 2009, seeing instances of wildcat striking activity, which was really unprecedented in terms of kind of post-Thatcher industrial relations. The Vistian investors' workplace occupations of 2009, which again, they might be small scale, but they were significant in terms of the forms of labour protest that we were seeing. The UK Uncut protest in 2010, the Universtiy student protests around the tuition fees in 2010, the Occupy movement, and the 2011 riots around the shooting of Mark Duggan, which again arguably were an expression of a more general malaise around poverty and economic deprivation. So we've seen movements towards forms of protest and mobilisation that are outside of the formal institutions of political representation, which is one of the expectations we would gain from this kind of third model. And then in terms of responses, we said basically those forms of nascent forms of protest and disruption are being largely dismissed or ignored by the political elite, and in terms of concessions, but we're also seeing forms of repression as well. And the forms that the repression has taken include, for example, if you look at the way that the government responded, or the government instructed the judiciary to respond to the 2011 riots, we saw much more severe forms of punishment than had historically been, would historically be expected as a response to rioting. The most obvious example being the 4-year prison sentence for the Facebook 2 who organised a riot that nobody turned up to, but still got put in prison for 4 years as a response. And then we say also that there's a move towards this kind of idea of using the promotion of capitalist subjectivity as an attempt at mechanisms of social control. So we talk a bit about Liam's thesis about the way that debt has been sold back to the public, and then we kind of combine that with Lazzarato's idea of of promoting the kind of debtor-creditor relationship as one of the main means of kind of micro-mechanisms of social control in the present. So if I sum up, I'm way over time, but if I sum up, I think what perhaps we're trying to say is that there are these three models of democracy. I don't think it's necessarily the case that we have to pick one as the one that's correct, but we are, I think, saying that the expectations that these three models generate seem to at least vary in terms of the strength with which the pressures that they identify can be seen in the contemporary context. And we basically go from the liberal model being the weakest to the overflowing and excess model being the highest in terms of the way in which it helps us to understand what's going on within contemporary democratic pressures for political and economic change. And if we just end with the kind of questions, so we've highlighted the themes and the debates that we're interested in, and then I guess we're ending with the questions that we think should be the focus of ongoing debate at the seminar, which is in Barcelona, which is perhaps the nicest location as well, so a cute place. Now, so to what extent has the crisis prompted new forms of participation? How do they relate to the existing institutions of political authority? And to what extent do we expect them to produce political, economic change and policy change? So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
So, hello, my name's Pollyanna Ruiz, and I really enjoyed the paper. I really like the big kind of scoping out that you do there. For my discipline, which is really different, I suspect, from all the disciplines in the room, or maybe it just feels that way to me. So I'm a media and communications scholar, And from my perspective, that's really, really useful because so much of the work in my field tends to be around particular case studies. It's very, very bottom up. So I look particularly at autonomous movements and anarchist movements, and I'm particularly interested in the way in which clusters of protesters that come from really different protest traditions, how they communicate with each other and how that impacts on their engagement with mainstream organisations, so government, policy, media. And so I found this a really useful way of thinking about things, and it kind of echoes with kind of developments in the field of media and communications as such. So I thought I would begin by just thinking a little bit about that theoretical model and then moving on to ask a couple of questions about each of the case studies in turn. And I suppose this tension that you pull out, which I really, really recognise from my own research, is this tension between the institutions of democracy and then what you describe as extra-institutional or autonomous movements, and how there is a kind of a lack of communication between them, a kind of barrier between them in many ways. And in my own work, my own research that I've done, I think this is largely or partially rooted in a kind of misunderstanding from the mainstream of how autonomous groups work, how anarchist groups work, and the kind of lack of familiarity with polyvocal dissent means that they're frequently conceptualized as being chaotic, as being destructive, as being anarchic in a negative rather than a potentially positive sense of the word. And therefore these repressive measures are brought in to kind of control these overflowing and excessive modes of participation in that way. So earlier on someone mentioned, more confrontational forms of politics. These are frequently seen as democracy having gone wrong in some way, as then being a symptom of the process not working. And this kind of understanding of these types of protest movements, I would argue, comes partly from a mismatch between the ways in which we think about the democratic process, which is rooted in a particular kind of Enlightenment tradition that has a kind of a particular set of binaries around how we think of the public sphere. So reason is privileged over passion, consensus over disconsensus, these kind of classic Habermasian concept of the public sphere, the way in which it's structured. And of course, as feminist scholars have pointed out, like Fraser, this has possibly unintended consequence of excluding many, many minority voices. So she gives the example of feminism and talks about the way in which hysterical women are traditionally excluded from the public sphere because they don't engage in a kind of reasonable, rational, consensus-led debate. And one can extend that out over the kind of exclusion of uppity black people or whatever. There's a whole list of mechanisms by which minority groups trying to access those public spheres are excluded. And Fraser argues, kind of in keeping with your second model, that there are kind of counter-publics where people can come together. Again, she gives the example of the feminist movement and talks about the way in which counter-publics enable subaltern groups to come together and reflect upon their identity away from the supervision of dominant groups, and then use that as a springboard back into official publics. And so this is a model that kind of becomes increasingly tolerant to protest and increasingly tolerant to more confrontational forms of protest. And we can move on right to think of Chantal Mouffe, who talks about how dissent is absolutely fundamental to the democratic process, that actually consent should not be the end point where we seek to arrive at, but that dissent and perpetual dissent is a necessary part of the democratic process, and to not have that risks excluding people from democratic processes. And I think if we think about that and then begin to also introduce into that, from my perspective as a media and communications scholar, the role in which the media play in this, because I think things like the two case studies that you've chosen and the way in which protest generally is developing is deeply, intimately interconnected with developments in media and communication. So protest is a mediated happening. It happens through the media. It doesn't just happen in the squares. It happens through social networking that brings people into the squares, and then through the traditional mainstream media that then amplifies that and circulates that around the nation more generally. So we kind of have a system, whereas Habermas thinking about the public sphere, the newspaper was the mechanism that brought the nation together in order for us to reflect on what constituted the greater good. We're now in a media environment in which those top-down, one-to-many models are replaced by many-to-many, horizontal, top-down, bottom-up models of communication, which really challenge the power dynamics around our understanding of democracy in a really important way. So it's not, and in addition to that, so that's kind of what the internet offers, in addition, devices like the mobile phone, which enables us to have that connectivity wherever we are, constantly. My phone is connected to my hand practically. When I go to bed, it's on my pillow beside me. And I never turn it off. There is that sense that we are permanently part of this network. We're permanently keeping an eye on what's going on. And this has, I would argue, radically transformed the protest environment. So we had a question earlier on about trade union movements and about collective identity and that sense of we-ness. And kind of the question implied that there was a loss. And I would kind of agree with that in some ways, in that the protest environment, I would say, is now characterized by this massive sense of rupture in some ways, that things are different to how they were before, partly through a mediated environment, partly perhaps through the crisis, but there was always some sense of this being, I think when you began today, you talked about it being a pivotal point, a punctuation mark, a sense of rupture happening. And at the same time, there's this sense of continuity, that something underneath is connecting up all of these moments, whether it's Tahrir Square or the Indignados in Spain or Occupy, that there are underlying elements that connect up these different processes. And then with that as well is this element of coalition, whereby different groups come together over a particular event, a particular issue. We may have very different ideological ends, but agree to coalesce around that particular mechanism or issue or means for that moment. And I think that raises a question, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you kind of generally, which is, in that environment, what happens to that collective sense of identity? What happens to that sense of we-ness? Because I think in your first two models, we can see how that sense of collective identity can be sustained and the way in which protests can coalesce around it. In your third model, I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's constantly shifting. It's a different type of identity, and I think that has real challenges for when protesters from autonomous movements try and engage with institutions that are permanent in a different way. And I think that raises a whole series of really fundamental questions about democracy. So that's the kind of theoretical bit. I'm talking really fast. Okay, and then the next bit is I wanted to think about the Spanish case study, which is really, really interesting. And one of the questions you asked, and in fact, rather helpfully for me, it's kind of there. Yes, the middle question, how do these relate to existing institutions of representative democracy and political authority? And I think this is a really core question, and you kind of hinted that 2014 was a significant year. And I think you're right, and I think that there is a kind of a slight crossroads that we're at potentially. So many autonomous movements are by definition small. Okay, they're small grassroots movements, and they tend to have come up from a kind of almost an anarchist tradition where you have a kind of a cell coming together to discuss things. And within that context, participatory democracy is still really, really tiring, and it takes a long time, and it's exhausting, but it is achievable. It can be an efficient way of doing things if you have the time and the passion and the commitment to do it. However, once you scale that up and it becomes bigger and bigger, it becomes increasingly inefficient as a mechanism by which things can get done. And it becomes inefficient not just because it takes much more time and much more patience, but it becomes difficult because the bigger the group, the more they need to engage with mainstream institutions. So, for example, many of the groups that I research purposefully reject the idea of a leader or a spokesperson, and they do everything horizontally, they do everything collectively, which is great until the local newspaper wants to ring up that group and say, what time is your demonstration? Why are you demonstrating? And then there's nobody to give that answer. An answer could be given, but first everyone has to discuss it and agree with it, and then somebody has to be elected to go and talk to the newspaper, and by then, it's gone. They're on to the next story. And of course, this steps up even more if these groups try and engage with kind of institutional democratic processes, for example, taking a seat in a council or something like that. All of these problems stack up on each other and they become harder and harder. So you move from what some people have described as a kind of radical democratic tradition to an ineffective democratic tradition, which isn't somehow working in some ways. And Paolo Gabaldo just recently published an article talking about Podemos and how they were going to reintroduce the idea of leaders precisely for these problems. And his argument, and I have to confess to having very briefly read this morning, so I hope I'm not giving a false impression of his argument, but his argument seemed to be that that the type of leaders that groups like Podemos have are a different type of leader. So they somehow have trust, they haven't lost trust, they have this kind of grassroots background tradition. And what I would ask is whether that's enough. I don't actually think that we need different types of leaders. I think we need a different type of leadership, which is much more about the systems and the structures and the social actors involved. And I think we can see models of that, perhaps in the Zapatistas with Subcovenant Marcos, who kind of wears his mask to iron out his own position and to try. He talks about his mask as a mirror. So his mirror reflects people back at each other, and so he tries to see himself not as the leader, he is Subcovenant Marcos, and as a mouthpiece for people. I don't know whether that would work. That's partly what my question is. So how when these grassroots movements scale up, how do they engage with mainstream institutions? How do they negotiate that shift? So that would be my first question. And then my second question was thinking about the UK example. And again, rather conveniently, the question is there: to what extent has the global economic crisis prompted new forms of participation? And I think this is really, really interesting. And I think it comes back down to this question at the beginning about whether this is a punctuation point in time, whether this is some kind of rupture after which everything is different. And we all want to live at a moment in history that's brand new and unlike anything that has gone before. But actually, most things have been around before, and people have been protesting for a long, long time. So we have George Mackay talks about protest and how it privileges immediacy. And of course it does. What do we want X? When do we want it now? It kind of really privileges the moment at the expense, he argues, of theory, of history, of a more embedded way of thinking about things. And I think from my discipline, which is media studies and social movement studies, this is exacerbated by kind of academic factors. So media studies is really interested in speed, in immediacy. Social movement studies is really interested in kind of mediated peaks and spectacle and conflict. So we have this focus on these peak moments where protest appears. And I wonder if we shouldn't sometimes be looking back in time and looking at the troughs between the peaks and asking ourselves what is happening in these spaces. Because if we look, for example, at the space between the Spanish Indignados and Occupy, or the space between Occupy on the steps of St. Paul's and the recent demonstrations outside Parliament for Occupy democracy there are really interesting things going on in that space in between. Really, I think, quite important things. So if we look at Occupy, let's say if we look at the relationship between Occupy and St. Paul's and Occupy democracy, Occupy St. Paul's seemed to be addressing the economic dynamics of neoliberalism. It was in Wall Street. They ended up on the steps of St. Paul's because they couldn't find a space in the city, but that's where they wanted to be. And so you have this attempt to engage with a set of economic questions. However, the fact that they were met with such repression meant that they shifted their focus to thinking about democracy instead, the democratic process, and why the state was not enabling them to protest, and why the state was aligned with economic powers in that way. And so you can see that when you look at it that way, you can make sense of the movement from Occupy St. Paul's to Occupy democracy being outside Westminster. And when you look at the little bubbles of protest that there has been just over the last month, so we had the student fees protest and we had the Black Lives Matter protests. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those protests all ended up trying to break down the fence that had been erected around the square in Parliament, outside the Houses of Parliament, to prevent Occupy democracy. It's as if when you look at those protest movements who may initially be protesting about something completely different, there's a blockage in the democratic process that means that they come back to this question of what is democracy and why is it not enabling us to do the things that we wish to do, to raise the issues that we want to raise and to discuss them in the public sphere. So that's a kind of roundabout way of coming to my second question, which is one about tactics. Is it that the tactics that we have and the tactics that you highlight here are really, really new, or are they echoes of tactics that have come before? Are they building on layers that have gone before? And by not looking at that, are we missing something that is really fundamental to our understanding of democracy? So that's 3 questions. One about collective identity, one about how marginal autonomous groups interact with institutional systems and structures, and one about protest tactics and their position in time, over time.